Hello, my name is Alyssa, and I will be discussing the network simulator lab that we had to do. The first lab that I am going to be talking about is the IPv4 address types and classes. This was a challenge for me. I know nothing about computers and computer language, so trying to learn the different classes and types of IP addresses was a challenge. Particularly, I have never been inclined to numbers. Numbers don't like me, I don't like numbers. Math has always been a struggle, so to try and recognize the difference between the different classes was a slight challenge. This lab was probably one of the labs that took me the longest to do, but it kind of gave me an understanding of what's to be expected in the future. The next one was identifying troubleshooting commands to use for various tasks. I am not familiar with computer language. This lab was a little bit of a struggle. I have only heard of maybe one or two of the terms that were used in this lab, but it was nice to kind of get a more in-depth look as to what is going to be expected further on, especially in the field. The security terminology and descriptions was actually one of the easier labs in this activity. This lab in particular, some of these I had heard before, these terms, so having that previous knowledge was a little bit more beneficial, especially in terms of trying to use my basis of knowledge to try and figure out the answers. Again, the types of network threats and attacks was kind of along the same lines. Having some previous knowledge and some basic understanding, it was kind of easier to figure out what was expected in terms of answering the questions. There were some terms that I had never heard of before, but that's not to say that I wasn't understanding of why it was termed the way that it was after figuring out the description. Security appliance terminology and methods. Again, I had heard of the different types, so having that basis was nice to kind of branch off of and kind of go a little bit more in depth on my previous knowledge. Identifying common Cat5 wiring problems. This lab was an introduction to some of the harder labs that I had to deal with in this project. I know nothing about computers. This is a very new field to me, particularly because I am a biology background with a research aspect, so I know nothing about the in-depth terminologies and expectations of how computers work and what they're supposed to do. So this is very new to me. So I struggled a little bit with the figuring out of what was expected. I also struggled with answering the questions in the entirety of this lab because I really do not know anything about computers or how they work. Trying to answer the questions in a detailed response that the simulator wanted was a struggle for me as well. Network topologies was actually very interesting. Now, while I have not heard of nor had any previous knowledge of this, having the biology background, it was nice to be able to put a visual aspect to the structure of what is expected. So in biology, structure relates to function, and having that knowledge, it was interesting to see how this might impact how computers work. Creating a straight cable and testing it, along with the other lab that was creating a cross cable and testing it, was definitely a struggle. Like I had mentioned before, I know nothing about computers and the basis of computers. So trying to figure out how to make the cables work was interesting and a little bit of a struggle, but it was also fun, particularly knowing that these cables could be used to connect computers to different modems, and if you have to use Ethernet, like that's why that wire is formed the way that it is. Like I said, the making the cross cable and testing it again, kind of same thing. I had no idea what to expect, but once I was able to test out the cables and see why they work the way that they do, it was actually really interesting. Matching command output to commands. This is where I started to become pretty fascinated, especially seeing the commands in action. I did slightly struggle with understanding the codes at certain points, but that's not to say that I did not have fun watching how everything fits together and how it codes. Verifying a data link connection from a computer to a network. This was actually really interesting because I had done, at least partially done, something similar at some point. I just didn't know what I was doing and why it was working. So it was really neat to see that something that I had done in real life was actually applied to the simulation. Configuring a client network adapter with an IPv4 address. This was also interesting to me because it kind of gave you a basis of what we had done in the lab just before it, but also kind of showing that IP address aspect from the beginning of the simulation. Using ipconfig to discover network settings. This was actually really interesting to me. I liked doing the simulation because it started kind of getting more in depth as to what was going to be happening later on, and why you were using certain commands and what they were supposed to do. So I actually started becoming intrigued, if not a little frustrated, just based on the fact that I, again, like I had mentioned before, have had no previous knowledge in computers, especially in-depth computer knowledge. So for me, while I love learning new things, it's also slightly scary, but I was actually pretty surprised at how far I was able to get in the labs. Using ping to troubleshoot connectivity. So again, branching off of the config command, this was interesting to see it actually in kind of slightly real time. Obviously, this is a simulation, but it was interesting to see the knowledge of why this is working the way that it does, and also kind of branching off the stuff that we had learned previously. Using ARP to discover a MAC address, again, having no computer knowledge, it was fascinating, if not slightly frustrating, especially trying to follow all the steps and making sure that you didn't miss anything when you were typing out the commands. It's a very, very finite little intricacies that I am starting to become more aware of the more that we do this. Using ipconfig, ping, ARP, and tracert together to troubleshoot connectivity. So again, using and continuously branching off of previous knowledge from the other examples we had done, it was interesting to see how everything is connected and starts to come together once you have to troubleshoot certain connectivity problems. Manually configuring wireless signals on a small office/home office router. This was also interesting because it was something that I think I had had slight previous knowledge in, having to try and troubleshoot my own wireless configurations and networks at home, kind of having to try and go through the back door, and even sometimes having to see it done remotely from the cable company. Having that previous knowledge, it was interesting to kind of see how everything kind of ties in together and why it works the way that it works. So again, branching off, especially with the security settings, making sure that everything was working the way that it should work. The troubleshooting practice, again, it was kind of nice to be able to branch off of what I had learned previously and trying to recall the steps that are involved in the process. Obviously, there are some intricate steps that you want to make sure that you can't miss, especially if you're off by just the littlest bit. But it is interesting to see it all come together. Configuring static host name resolution on a workstation. Again, it was a branch off of the basis that we had formed earlier in the lab, but trying to apply it to a Windows application, which was interesting to see, particularly since most of the computers on campus are actually Windows computers. So knowing that if there were something that I would have to do on a UNE computer, it's nice to know that this is kind of the basis of what's going on. For this lab, it was a little bit of a struggle, just again trying to make sure that there wasn't anything that I missed. I try to be as attentive to detail as possible, but every once in a while there are some times where due to human nature and human error, something is missed. So I have a much more of an appreciation for the people in IT, especially the IT people that we have on campus, knowing that they're trying to keep together this huge operation up and running and working smoothly, knowing that there's some things that if you're just off by the littlest bit or one letter, could really make a difference. I have a lot more respect for the field and an understanding of what they go through. Configuring an Ethernet interface on a router. Again, this is nice to kind of have a background in, especially because previously I didn't really understand how Ethernet worked. And now, again, knowing the intricacies of even just the wiring and all of the process that goes into the wiring itself, let alone the actual network and the routers, is pretty fascinating. Using Tracert to troubleshoot connectivity. Again, I had never heard of Tracert. It was actually really interesting to kind of have that insight to it. And I am very curious to see how all of this is going to come together further in the field, especially when we will have to do our field work in the future. Creating network users on a domain controller. Since I do not have to deal with adding users onto the network, this was interesting for me, especially kind of having a glimpse of what might be a possibility if I were to go further in the field, having to add someone new to the domain and then knowing that once they're added, the rights that they have to the access that's in the domain, I think is really important. Configuring a VPN client. This was interesting because, again, this was building off of previous examples that we had done, and kind of seeing it all put together kind of really put things into a deeper perspective for me. And that is the end of my slideshow, and I will be signing off. Thank you.